Okay, so our next speaker is Travis Britton, and Travis is from University of Western Sydney, and looking forward to your talk.
Hi everyone, I'm Travis. I'm a postdoc in Ian Wright's group at Western Sydney Uni. And today I'm going to be talking about trait-climate relationships in eucalyptus, and specifically a study looking at these relationships in a common environment and comparing that to in the field. And so this work is part of a larger collaboration with the UTAS Plant Success node, as well as Dean Nicole at Currency Creek Arboretum, and also others at Western Sydney Uni. So trait-climate relationships can help us identify how plants have adapted to enable their survival and growth in a range of different environmental conditions. So you can see the different vegetation types here, where you have plants that have adapted to grow in these very dry to very wet conditions, and very cold to very warm conditions. And so two key aspects of climate that control the distribution of vegetation and its diversity across the globe is precipitation and temperature. And so a core goal of trait-based ecology is in this huge range of diversities to try to identify specific characteristics or traits that plants have evolved that makes them optimised or suited to those environments. And a key focus is to develop separate theories for both these different climate predictors, so here precipitation and temperature. And this is particularly important in the face of future climate change, as although these two aspects of climate are often very correlated, they're actually not expected to always shift in tandem in the future. So when we explore trait-climate relationships in natural conditions, we measure traits on a plant and then we match it with those climatic conditions that plant is growing in. So here in natural conditions, that trait value is the combination of its evolutionary history, so its genetics, as well as adaptation or acclimation to those current environmental conditions. And so some general trait-climate relationships have emerged, which is such as what you can see this hypothetical example here. But what is less clear is the degree to which those different plant traits are responsive to the prevailing environmental conditions. And so we can address this with common gardens, where we grow plants from a range of different environmental conditions, from a range of different environments under a common set of conditions. And so here I'm just showing that now in blue. And this is where we still measure those same traits on the plants, but we now relate it to the climate of origin, so where those plants are from. And so in this example here, I'm showing an example of a highly conserved trait. And so this is a trait that is not responsive to those new conditions that it's growing in. And so this means that its relationship with the climate doesn't differ, and that means that these slopes are the same. So we'd say that the difference between these, or the delta slope, is 0. At the other extreme, if we saw all species or all plants in the common garden express the same trait value, regardless of where they originated from, we'd say that they're responding very strongly to those prevailing environmental conditions and show no patterning with climate of origin. We would say that this is a highly labile trait and the slopes differ substantially, so there'd be a large delta slope. And sorry, the previous example shows a highly conserved trait. And in reality, we'll probably actually see something in between these two extremes. And so calculating the delta slope on standardised data is just a way that we can sort of determine how labile or conserved these different traits are relative to one another. So we set out to explore these questions in eucalyptus using two different data sets. So the first was at Currency Creek Arboretum in South Australia, which is a common garden, and here we sampled 213 species of eucalypt for a range of different traits, and then we paired those trait data with the climate data of where those seeds were sourced from. So you can see those in blue geographically, as well as in the climate space as well, so against temperature on the x-axis and precipitation on the y-axis. And then the second database that we used was the AusTraits plant trait database. So here, this is plants growing in their natural conditions, and then we pulled data for 327 eucalypt species, and then this time we matched that trait data with the climate data of where that trait was measured. And this is now shown in orange. And then you can see in the grey points, this is just all eucalypts, their occurrence and also their climate space across Australia in grey. So you can see we've got a pretty decent coverage across the whole, all of eucalyptus. And so we measured the same set of traits in both data sets. So these were leaf morphology traits, leaf nutrients, carbon isotopes, leaf versus stem allocation, as well as wood traits. And today I'm just going to briefly discuss three. So starting with leaf nitrogen per unit area. So leaf nitrogen has a metabolic as well as a structural component, but the metabolic component, so specifically rubisco, the photosynthetic enzyme involved in carbon fixation, forms the basis of our predictions. So we expect higher leaf nitrogen at drier sites because more rubisco increases the carboxylation capacity, which means more carbon can be fixed for a given amount of water lost via transpiration. So essentially it reduces the water costs for a given carbon gain. And then for temperature, all else being equal, we expect more leaf nitrogen at colder sites because more rubisco is required to generate a given carboxylation capacity compared to warmer sites where enzyme activity is enhanced, so you need less rubisco, so less nitrogen. So we expect negative relationships with both precipitation and temperature. And this was supported in natural conditions, so you can see a negative relationship here in the Austrates data with both precipitation and temperature. And so all these figures I'm going to show today are partial residual plots, so these are from a multiple regression with both temperature and precipitation as predictors, and they just illustrate the relationship between the trait and either temperature or precipitation when the other predictors held constant. So you can see definitely there's negative relationships, but there's a stronger relationship with precipitation. And in common conditions, you see this negative relationship with precipitation, but a flatter slope. So this indicates that this relationship is relatively labile, whereas the relationship with temperature doesn't differ. So this suggests that that temperature relationship appears somewhat conserved. The second trait is leaf mass per area, which is a leaf economics trait. So this indicates the investment strategy of a leaf over its lifetime, and this ranges from low LMA leaves, which are an acquisitive, fast strategy with thinner or less dense leaves, so if you imagine a basil leaf, and then high LMA leaves, which are a more conservative, slower strategy with thicker or denser leaves, so if you imagine a Banksia leaf. So in wet conditions, we expect this more acquisitive, low LMA leaves compared to in drier conditions where you would, these tougher, hardier leaves and more conservative, slower strategy would be favoured. And similarly in cold environments, we expect these higher LMA leaves, so a slower, more conservative strategy and those thicker, hardier leaves. So again, we expect negative relationships between both climate predictors. And so this is supported for precipitation in those natural conditions, so you can see that negative relationship, but we found no relationship with temperature. And in common conditions, again, we see that same negative relationship with precipitation, but again, that's a flatter slope, so it indicates that it's somewhat labile. Whereas for temperature, again, we see no relationship in the common garden as well. And the final trait is wood density that I'm going to talk about. So this represents a trade-off in wood that is fast growing, has a low fibre wall content, but is more prone to damage. Whereas then you have high density wood, which is slower growing, has a higher fibre wall content, and is more resistant to damage. And so the relationship with precipitation is quite well known. So we know that this sort of slower growing, more resistant, dense wood is favoured in dry conditions compared to wet. And then for temperature, the theory is less well developed, but in general, we would expect in colder conditions where there's this slower growth and they're potentially facing freezing damage to have denser wood as well. So again, negative relationships with both. And so this is supported with both in the natural conditions where we have these negative relationships, but you can see again, it's a stronger relationship with precipitation. And in common conditions, again, you can see this negative relationship with precipitation remains, but it is a slightly flatter slope, indicating that there's some lability in this trait in response to precipitation, whereas the relationship with temperature is that there's actually no relationship with temperature in the common garden. So this suggests that there's some degree of lability in this relationship, but those slopes actually don't significantly differ. So then what we did was we calculated this delta slope for all 8 traits. So I've just highlighted the 3 that I've talked about today. And again, this is on standardised predictors to allow comparisons between the traits, where a larger number indicates a more labile trait and a smaller number a more conserved trait. And if those confidence intervals overlap 0, it means that there was no significant difference in those slopes. So you can see of the 3 traits that I discussed today in response to temperature, leaf nitrogen per unit area seems the most labile, followed by leaf mass per area, and then finally wood density being the most conserved. And then for temperature, in general, we found that the relationships with temperature were just generally weaker, both in natural and common conditions, and that the traits in general also appeared more conserved in their relationships with temperature. So, for example, of those 3 traits that I showed today, we actually found no significant difference in the slopes between the 2 data sets for all 3 of those in relation to temperature. So these are all quite preliminary results, so we're still working through the specific interpretations, but in general, particularly for precipitation, we seem to see these leaf traits, so in particular leaf size and leaf nutrients, seem most labile, whereas then these more structural traits, so leaf mass per area and wood density, seem to be more conserved. And so applying this approach to this wide range of traits that we've done can indicate 2 things. So firstly, it can tell us which traits appear quite conserved and are under a strong genetic control. So this can help us narrow our focus for future genetics work. And secondly, it can help us identify which traits are labile, so which respond strongly to new environmental conditions, which can sort of, indicate to us what adaptive strategies eucalypts have that might help them respond to changing environmental conditions and in particular climate change. And so to finish, I just want to flag that this general framework is part of a larger effort within our node at Western Sydney. So we're exploring these trait-climate relationships in common garden and in field conditions across a range of different plant groups. So me and Tian are working in Eucalyptus, with Tian leading the hydraulics and wood anatomy work, and she's got a poster as well. And also in the grasses, which is Vin, Emma and Anu, and so looking in native sorghum and then also kangaroo grass. And I'd just like to acknowledge everyone that contributed and happy to take any questions.
Thank you. That was great. Thanks very much. Any questions?
Thanks, Travis. Just a question, I think I always ask this question, about the aridity. So, using the mean annual precip, I mean, it probably catches, the general notion of what's dry and wet. But, I mean, we've had a number of talks previously that have highlighted the importance of VPD. And so I wondered if you've looked at the ratio of precipitation to potential evapotranspiration as a more generic indicator of aridity.
So we do. I haven't in relation to this sort of new analysis, but I have looked at the trait-climate relationships with the moisture index or aridity index, whatever you call it. And you get the same sort of relationships. Like at some traits it's stronger, other traits it's weaker. But in general, I just decided to pick precipitation sort of just from the outset and just decide that that was sort of my measure of water availability or water stress that those plants would be suffering. But yeah, there's definitely scope to sort of fiddle with some of the different climate predictors for sure.
One of the subtleties with looking at VPD, soil water in perennial species is that variation, that transient variation. I think Graham Farquhar and co in ANU did quite a lot of work on oxygen and carbon isotopic discrimination. You mentioned carbon isotopes. Had you looked at the potential for discrimination and the relationships therein? Because I know many of them tie in with the traits you measured.
So we had delta carbon 13 as sort of one of our main traits, and then we sort of changed that too, because we calculated the CI/CA ratio, so the internal CO2 to external CO2 concentrations. That was one of the traits that I've listed, but I just haven't gone into it today. But yeah. Sweet.
No more questions?
Perfect.
Oh, thank you very much, Trav.